Échale, ya estoy desconectando aquí todo. Buenas tardes, a nombre del Colegio Nacional y a nombre propio les quiero dar la bienvenida a esta sesión vespertina, donde vamos a tratar el tema de las extinciones biológicas. Es de manera natural la consecuencia de las espléndidas charlas que acabamos de oír sobre muerte celular, pero ahora tratar de colocar el fenómeno de la desaparición no solo de células individuales, sino de poblaciones de organismos o de especies o de grandes grupos biológicos a lo largo del registro fósil. Estamos todos acostumbrados a pensar, en realidad, cuando hablamos de las extinciones, en la desaparición de los dinosaurios, que probablemente son uno de los organismos favoritos de todos nosotros, y tal vez a veces, si tenemos un poco de información biológica, pensamos en la desaparición de los trilobites o la desaparición de grupos de plantas durante el Cretácico, etcétera. Ustedes han tenido la oportunidad de escuchar aquí en el Colegio Nacional las consecuencias que los impactos de meteoritos, en particular el del Cretácico-Jurásico, tuvo en términos del abatimiento brutal de la diversidad biológica, pero en realidad ha habido grandes extensiones mucho más poderosas, mucho más dramáticas que la del Cretácico-Jurásico, como las extinciones del Pérmico. Y cuando uno piensa a nivel de la historia de la vida en el planeta, lo que resulta extraordinariamente asombroso es darse cuenta de la sucesión constante de extinciones que hemos tenido desde que la vida comienza hace unos 3.800, 3.700 millones de años en la Tierra. Generalmente, cuando uno piensa en las extinciones de los grupos biológicos como los que he mencionado, estamos hablando de extinciones en los últimos 600 millones de años, el periodo que conocemos como el Fanerozoico. Y Charles Darwin, que era el principal crítico de sí mismo, cuando escribe El origen de las especies y la publica en 1859, se pregunta: ¿y qué ocurre cuando me voy a rocas sedimentarias más antiguas en donde no veo fósiles? Y Darwin empieza a dar una serie de explicaciones sobre que tal vez los regímenes geológicos eran distintos, sobre que tal vez el tipo de sedimentos no permitía la acumulación, y una de las grandes alternativas que Darwin no tocó es precisamente el de la vida microbiana que ha dominado en el planeta durante toda la vida de la biosfera en la Tierra. En realidad, si nosotros nos vamos hacia atrás en el tiempo, de repente vemos una fase en la que dejamos de ver mamuts. Si seguimos retrocediendo en el tiempo, dejamos de ver neandertales. Si seguimos retrocediendo en el tiempo, dejamos de ver dinosaurios, dejamos de ver trilobites. Y lo que nunca dejamos de ver en el registro paleontológico son los restos fósiles de microorganismos. Los fósiles de microorganismos a veces los podemos identificar como tales y tienen una morfología muy característica, o bien a veces los podemos identificar por lo que llamamos el fraccionamiento isotópico. Isotópico, el isótopo, el fraccionamiento isotópico, viene de dos términos griegos: isos igual y topos lugar. En la tabla periódica de los elementos, un átomo de hidrógeno siempre va a ocupar el mismo lugar porque tiene un solo protón, pero además del átomo de hidrógeno normal que tiene un solo protón, podemos tener deuterio o podemos tener tritio que tienen otras partículas elementales, pueden tener neutrones, y entonces la masa atómica cambia, aunque el número atómico, que es el número de protones, no cambie. Los seres vivos tenemos un rasgo muy peculiar, y es que en general preferimos los isótopos más ligeros para los procesos biológicos. Por ejemplo, una planta va a estar fijando dióxido de carbono de la atmósfera, pero en la atmósfera vamos a tener dióxido de carbono con carbono 12, con carbono 13 y con carbono 14. Las tres formas de dióxido de carbono son el mismo compuesto químico, el mismo elemento en el mismo compuesto químico, que es el dióxido de carbono. Pero una planta, aparentemente por razones de economía bioenergética, prefiere fijar el dióxido de carbono 12 en lugar del dióxido de carbono 14. Y esto va a producir a lo largo del registro paleontológico lo que llamamos un fraccionamiento isotópico, en donde podemos reconocer a veces no solo grupos biológicos, sino metabolismos muy específicos que han mostrado distintos patrones de fraccionamiento. Es decir, tenemos varios tipos de registro fósil, no solo el registro morfológico, no solo el registro del fraccionamiento isotópico, sino que además tenemos un registro adicional, que es el que está mencionado en el título de esta mesa redonda, de esta sesión, que es el registro molecular. Yo puedo comparar las secuencias de moléculas como proteínas o como los ácidos nucleicos, y al hacerlo puedo ir reconstruyendo la historia de la vida, fijándome en algunas moléculas que son lo que llamamos marcadores evolutivos. Para ejemplificar esto muy rápidamente, permítanme asomarme a los terrenos de un amigo y colega muy querido del Colegio Nacional, que es el doctor Luis Fernando Lara, filólogo. Yo puedo tomar, por ejemplo, la palabra madre en español y la puedo comparar con Mutter en alemán, con mother en inglés, y evidentemente mother y Mutter están más cercanas entre sí, y eso quiere decir que en realidad las tres palabras tienen un mismo origen, pero la divergencia entre mother y Mutter ocurrió después de que la divergencia que separó a las lenguas germánicas de las lenguas romances. La palabra madre ahí está. Puede ocurrir que las moléculas sean idénticas. Madre en italiano se dice igual que en español, madre, y entonces no me sirve muy bien para distinguirla esa como un marcador evolutivo. Si yo quiero hacer una evolución de las lenguas, no puedo usar el término tlacoyo, porque el término tlacoyo que todos conocemos es exclusivo del español, y si yo le digo, y del español que hablamos en México además, y si yo trato de hacer una filogenia, ya dejé fuera al ruso, al croata, al griego y al alemán. Entonces, se dan cuenta que tengo que escoger con mucho cuidado mi molécula. Bueno, los biólogos hemos aprendido que hay una serie de moléculas espléndidas, como las moléculas del aparato que llamamos el ribosoma, que sintetiza las proteínas, que son muy conservadas, y eso nos ha permitido describir la diversidad biológica de la Tierra, que hay en la Tierra, con una precisión absolutamente extraordinaria. Estos no nada más son ejercicios intelectuales, también, que son legítimos en sí mismos, sino que también pueden tener una enorme aplicación práctica. Por ejemplo, si yo quiero saber de dónde vienen los genes de resistencia a un antibiótico, pues empiezo a comparar las secuencias de proteínas o las secuencias de DNA, y esto me va a permitir rastrear cómo han estado brincando genes de una especie hacia otra. Esto es bastante importante. Hay algunas cepas extraordinariamente patógenas de microorganismos que tradicionalmente habíamos pensado que habían brincado de los cerdos en las granjas donde se crían hacia los humanos, pero cuando se hicieron las filogenias moleculares nos dimos cuenta que en realidad éramos los humanos los que habíamos contagiado a los cerdos, y ahora estos son los que tienen bacterias resistentes a muchos antibióticos, y la consecuencia de eso ahora le estamos pagando desde luego las poblaciones humanas. ¿Se dan ustedes cuenta pues que hay una serie de vericuetos en las filogenias moleculares, en los fraccionamientos isotópicos o en los fraccionamientos, o en los fósiles morfológicos, en el estudio de los fósiles morfológicos, que todos sumados me permiten ir reconstruyendo la historia de surgimientos y desapariciones de grandes grupos biológicos? Uno de los grandes expertos que ha cambiado por completo nuestra visión del precámbrico es el doctor Andrew Knoll, un viejo amigo de la Universidad de Harvard, que muy generosamente aceptó la invitación para venir y hablarnos hoy de todo lo que ocurrió en ese larguísimo periodo de la historia de la Tierra, que en los libros de antes se llamaba el azoico, con la alfa privativa y son de vida más que de animal, pensando que no había formas de vida, pero él, con una acuciosidad extraordinaria, ha descrito no solamente los microorganismos que ha habido en el precámbrico, sino la dinámica evolutiva de grupos que desaparecen, grupos que surgen, lo que ocurre cuando hubo deriva continental de las grandes masas de tierra que se agruparon y se fragmentaron durante este periodo que dura, es de hecho el periodo más largo en la historia de la Tierra. El otro conferencista del día de hoy es el doctor Bruce Lieberman de la Universidad de Kansas, con quien tengo una buena amistad desde hace unos años y puedo decir que los dos somos sobrevivientes, si no de las Islas Galápagos, al menos sí de un chofer que completamente embriagado nos pasó por las mismas zonas donde Darwin anduvo, y creo que estamos aquí como una demostración de la capacidad de resistencia que tienen si no todos los humanos, cuando menos los biólogos evolutivos, cuando de sobrevivir se trata. De manera que esto es los temas que vamos a abordar del día de hoy. Le voy a ceder la palabra con un enorme placer, primero al doctor Andy Knoll, después va a hablar el doctor Lieberman y después vamos a tener una sesión de preguntas y comentarios donde las intervenciones de ustedes son absolutamente bienvenidas. Andy, if you please.
Buenas tardes. I begin by first thanking the Colegio Nacional for the opportunity to be with you today, and also for apologizing that I'm going to have to deliver my lecture in English. I thought about doing it in Spanish, but I realized that I would simply say cerveza over and over and over again. So what I'm going to do today is just introduce a number of somewhat related points that I hope will guide us in conversation a little bit later. So one of the things that I found extremely interesting over the course of this week is the difference in the way biologists and people who are interested in culture think about death. Certainly, as you all know, and as we heard in some wonderful lectures earlier in the week, that cultural beliefs really imbue death with a tremendous importance, probably because we all contemplate our own death, we all experience the death of family members and loved ones. In biology, death is treated somewhat more prosaically. Death is simply the inevitable consequence of life. Without death, the experiment of life on the planet Earth would have been very short, and so it is, in some ways, death is simply the other side of that coin called life. Now, that said, it is true that all organisms eventually die, but the biological significance of that death is slightly different, I think, between, say, animals like ourselves and microorganisms. So that in a microorganism, death is simply the way of completing the carbon cycle. If you think about it, we can think of a world in which there are photosynthetic bacteria that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and fix it into the organic matter in their cells. If there is no death, in time, those microorganisms will simply deplete the atmosphere of CO2 and the experiment of life will be over. So somehow there has to be a way of cycling that carbon back into the atmosphere so that it will be available for future generations of photosynthetic microbes. And that, of course, is done by other bacteria, at least originally on the young Earth. And those are bacteria that, like ourselves, will respire organic matter or ferment it, obtaining energy from those reactions and essentially liberating CO2 back into the atmosphere. That carbon cycle is the essential ecological circuitry of life on this planet, and it fundamentally depends on death as well as life. In animals like ourselves, things are a little bit different, that we may have 6 trillion cells in our bodies, but only a small subset of those cells are going to participate in forming a new generation. That is, early in development, a small number of cells become specified to become either eggs or sperm, and those are the only cells in our body that will propagate a new generation. All of the other cells then, in a sense, once reproduction has happened, lose their biological utility. And so for animals, death is actually the completion of the life cycle as well as contributing to the completion of the carbon cycle. Now, we can scale up from the death of individuals to think about populations that make up species. And we all know the term extinction. Extinction is simply what happens when all individuals in a population of a species die. And extinction in some ways is a special province of paleontology because paleontologists can look through the fossil record, see what the composition of life has been throughout Earth history, and the one obvious feature of that record is that nearly every species that we identify in the fossil record is extinct. So just as death is the inevitable consequence of life, extinction is, in essence, the inevitable consequence of the birth of species. And there, I just show two slides here. One on the left is something that you can see at the National Anthropological Museum, not far from here. It is something called Australopithecus afarensis, a close relative of ours that lived a few million years ago, but has been extinct for the last 3 million years. And again, the observation that species become extinct through time actually allows geologists to make a relative time scale that allows us to tell whether rocks are the same age or not. Now, much more unusual is the situation that we see on the right. This from the work of Nick Longstretch in the UK. And what this shows, here's a time series from about 140 million years ago to about 50 million years ago. And that red line is a very special moment in Earth history. At 66 million years ago, it is a time of major extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period. And what this diagram actually shows is prior to that boundary, there are quite a few different lizards that have been found as fossils, and what you see is that very few of them actually extend above the boundary. Many species go extinct at the same time, and as some of you will know, this is the exact time when all dinosaurs go extinct. Many of the skeletonized plankton in the oceans go extinct. Probably the major carnivores and predators in the oceans, a group of cephalopods called ammonites, go extinct. This is one of a small number of intervals in the last 500 million years, which is a true mass extinction, a time of rapid and catastrophic extinction that actually changes the fabric of biology on the planet. Now, I'm going to say just a few words about one mass extinction, in part because it's one that has been near and dear to my heart for the last 20 years. And also, it's an extinction that I think becomes a distant mirror on things that are occurring today. What you see on the left is simply a compilation of all the genera of skeletonized marine fossils that have been described from different intervals through time. You can see at the beginning of the Cambrian period that diversity is low, and it increases through time, but it doesn't increase monotonically. Rather, there are 5 times when diversity drops catastrophically, and these are the times of major mass extinctions in our planet's history. This one that you see here is the end of the Cretaceous period. That's what we talked about in the last slide. And the one that I've marked with the arrow here at 252 million years ago is the end of the Permian period, when the largest known mass extinction took place. This is a geological succession in China where you see the evidence of this extinction dramatically. As you climb this cliff, these limestones are full of fossils of marine organisms that lived in the late Permian period. And when you get to the top of this cliff right here, they all disappear, actually at a horizon that you can put a knife blade down on, and you never see any of them again. It's a very almost eerie thing to look at. So one of the questions is, what causes these? We know that the extinction of the dinosaurs at the 66 million years ago was caused by a very large meteorite that hit the planet, but there's no evidence for that 252 million years ago. Rather, this was a time of massive volcanism. And to give you some sense of just how massive that volcanism is, on the right I have two panels that really were put together by Lindy Elkins Tanton, a very good geologist in the United States. And in the top, you see the largest volcanic episodes ever witnessed by humans or their close ancestors. And the size of these blocks is proportional to the volume of lava that was extruded during these extinctions. Now, on the bottom, these, now at a different scale, are these extinctions, and this is what happened at the end of the Permian. This is volcanism literally 1 million times greater than any volcanism ever experienced by humans. And one can say, what would be the consequences of that? Well, a major consequence is that there would be a great deal of carbon dioxide delivered to the atmosphere. And we can actually go to a place like Hawaii, where there are basaltic volcanoes today, measure the amount of carbon dioxide that's being released through volcanism, and if we use that as our guidepost, we find out that the amount of CO2 released at the end of the Permian period would have been something like 10 to 1,000 times the amount of carbon dioxide in the late Permian atmosphere. And that's probably an underestimate for geologic reasons that we could talk about if you're interested. What would be the consequences of that? What would be the biological consequences? Well, if you put a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere rapidly, you get global warming. So the Earth got warmer. If you put CO2 into the atmosphere, some of it will dissolve in seawater, and the pH of seawater will go down, something called ocean acidification. There are also direct physiological consequences of high CO2 called hypercapnia. And also, because the oceans are getting warmer, they can carry less oxygen, and particularly in deeper parts of the ocean, we would expect to have oxygen depletion. Now, those of you who read the newspaper know that that's a description that should be familiar to you, because that's exactly what's happening in the 21st century. So, what happened then to the biology? Well, interestingly, we can actually look at the biology of living species and make some predictions for whether their fossil ancestors should have been tolerant to increased CO2 or should have been vulnerable to extermination because of it. And we can do that based on how they make their skeletons, which makes a great deal of difference. We can look at their metabolic rate, which makes a difference. We can look at the complexity of their anatomy. Do they have differentiated gills or a circulatory system? We can see whether they're living on top of the sediment or within it. And when you do that and predict, the top panel here is organisms that lived in the late Permian, which were very diverse. And simply on the basis of the physiology of their closest living relatives, we predicted that they would be vulnerable to extinction. And you can see that the diversity just drops. 90% of those taxa disappear. On the other hand, there are some organisms that were living in the late Permian oceans that one would guess or predict that they would be more tolerant of elevated CO2, and they more or less don't notice the end Permian events. The result of that is that the extinction, which was really catastrophic, it is also selective, and so the organisms that survived that extinction are a biased subset of the organisms that lived in late Permian oceans, and so when diversity reestablished itself, it was a very different ecosystem than had existed before the extinction. And you can do this just looking at the composition of skeletons, and again, what one finds is at the level of the genus, for those organisms that made massive carbonate skeletons out of calcium carbonate, but have a limited physiological ability to modulate the fluids from which they make those skeletons, they lost nearly 90% of their genera. Organisms that actually didn't make calcium carbonate skeletons, again, only lost 5%. So the extinction is not only depleting diversity, but it is depleting it in a biased way that really changes the course of evolution. And just to finish this section then, there is a lesson in that for our own century. We are living at a time when the rate of carbon dioxide increase in the atmosphere is probably the highest it has been in well over 100 million years. And in fact, it won't make you feel very good to think that the only process that we know of in Earth history that seems to change the environment in the way that industrial humans are doing it is volcanism 1,000,000 times larger than anything you will ever experience. In fact, there's been a lot of research over the last 15 years on the physiology of organisms in the oceans to really try to understand how the marine biota will react to the conditions that are changing at a very rapid rate. And very interestingly, I have a quote here from a very good biologist named Frank Meltzer in Germany, and he said, all more tolerant taxa, this is in the experiments, are characterized by high metabolic rates and high levels of mobility and activity. That actually turns out to be a very good description of the organisms that survived the late Permian crisis as well. So in this case, we have evidence of an extinction in the deep past that actually gives us some information on what we might expect if we are not wise enough to change our ways in the near future. Now, most discussion of extinction deals with plants and animals. They are the conspicuous organisms of the last 500 million years or so. But Antonio actually asked me to think a little bit about extinction before that. You know, life existed for a long time before the advent of animals, and what can we actually say about that? And this slide, again, makes a point in time and a point of the relatedness of organisms. Here we have a time interval. Now, the entire interval in which we have plants and animals is the last 600 million years, from this arrow on up. Yet we know that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and we actually have a geologic record preserved through much of that time. Was life present, and if so, what would we expect to see? This is where the genetic or genealogical relationships of organisms, or phylogenetic relationships of organisms, come in. This is what is sometimes called a universal tree of life. It is an estimate of genealogical relationships among organisms based on the comparison of, say, nucleotide sequences in DNA or amino acid sequences in proteins. And here we have bacteria. Here we have the other prokaryotic group, archaea. The important thing is that all of the animals that make up this conspicuous fossil record of the last 600 to 550 million years, all are found in just a distal twig on the tip of one branch. The greater diversity of life, and by implication, the deeper history of life, is largely microbial. Now that brings up a practical question, which is, can we actually hope to reconstruct an evolutionary history of microorganisms through time? Do they actually leave a fossil record that we can look at? And so to illustrate that, this is from a place where I worked when I was younger and fitter in the Arctic island of Spitsbergen. And what you're looking at here is about 1,000 meters of limestones, which were formed about 800 million years ago. There are no tracks or trails in these limestones. There are no skeletons. But is there any evidence for life? Well, if you go and look closely at some of those, as you see here, you'll see that there are these wavy laminations. And to a geologist, those tell us that these limestones accumulated as muds, but by interacting with microbial communities that lived on the seafloor. And if you take these little nodules that are in black here, made of silica, or SiO2, sometimes called flint or chert, cut a paper-thin slice and look at it under a microscope, they actually preserve microfossils. Each one of these individuals is about 4 microns in diameter. So they're very tiny, but they tell us something about early life. And in fact, when we look in rocks of this age, there are no animals, but as phylogeny would predict, there's actually a high diversity of both bacterial types of fossils and protozoans and simple multicellular algae. So the good news is there is a deeper fossil record. We can trace it back through time. We have other evidence for life. For example, if there are places today, this is a place called Shark Bay in Western Australia, where microbial communities actually trap and bind sediments and cement to form these little reef-like structures, which are called stromatolites. What we see here are stromatolites in some rocks that are 800 million years old, and in this cliff, these structures that you see here, about 5 meters thick, are actually patch reefs made by microorganisms just the way corals make reefs today. So they tell us that life was everywhere in the photic zone. And indeed, there are chemical signatures of life. Many microorganisms don't preserve well in terms of their sizes and shapes, but many of them have molecules in them that accumulate in the geologic record. Sadly, that doesn't include DNA or proteins. They're just good food for bacteria, and they don't last very long. But some lipids do. So, for example, many bacteria have something called hopanoids, which are membrane lipids. Those preserve in the geologic record. Eukaryotes tend to have membrane lipids called sterols, and those accumulate. I like to tell my students that when you die, the last part of your body to be preserved for future generations will be your cholesterol. And that's really pretty much true. And then, even though individual microorganisms are small, they are so numerous in the oceans that they actually affect the chemical composition of seawater. So if you go out to the coast today, go down to Veracruz or something like this, and look at the ratio of the 2 stable isotopes of carbon, carbon-13 and carbon-12, in limestones, and then do the same thing, and you do this with a mass spectrometer, do the same thing with organic matter that's associated with them, you'll notice that the organic matter is depleted in C13 by about 25 parts per thousand relative to the limestone. And what this diagram shows is if you do that exercise all the way back through 3.5 billion years of Earth history, you will see that the isotopic composition of limestones and that of organic matter differ by 25 to 30 parts per thousand, and that tells us we had a biological carbon cycle through that entire interval. The reason, I should say, for that difference is that when organisms take CO2 for photosynthesis, they preferentially incorporate CO2 with the lighter carbon isotope C12. So what happens? We've now seen that in 800 million year old rocks, the fingerprint of life is everywhere. Here are some rocks that are now twice that age from northern Siberia. And again, they have microfossils, both protozoans and bacteria. There are stromatolites. Here's a stromatolite about the size of this podium. My friend is standing on a stromatolite about the size of this auditorium, and the entire wall behind him is a stromatolite reef that's somewhat larger than this building. We also have chemical fossils. So again, 1,500 million years ago, the fingerprints of life are everywhere. So what happens if we go to the oldest rocks we can look at, rocks that are more than 3 billion years old in Western Australia? Well, what we find is there's already a signature of life there. We have stromatolites, we have chemical fossils in terms of carbon and sulfur isotopes. And so what those tell us is that Earth has been a biological planet for most of its history, and most of the biological history of this planet is a history of microorganisms. The other thing we can say about early life is that it existed in a world without oxygen. Various chemical signatures in rocks tell us that for the first billion years or more of biological evolution, there was essentially no oxygen in the atmosphere or oceans. Those signatures change about 2.4 billion years ago, which is the time when oxygen produced by photosynthesis is starting to leak into the atmosphere and surface ocean, changing the nature of environments forever. Well, the question then is, if we look in that deeper record of life, and it's really the first 85% of the history of life, can we say anything about extinction? Well, if we look at bacteria, and if you simply look at the fossils that you find, which we see here on the left, all of these fossil bacteria look a lot like living bacteria, particularly living photosynthetic bacteria called cyanobacteria. However, if we look in a different way, we can make a case that there was extinction among bacteria on the early Earth. And on the right here, what I'm showing is just a phylogeny, again, a tree showing the genealogical relationships of the cyanobacteria, those photosynthetic bacteria. Again, I know you can't see the details, it doesn't matter. The important thing is that all of the cyanobacteria that are important constituents of the phytoplankton, that is, cells floating around in the surface ocean, all the ones living today only originated something on the order of 700 or 800 million years ago, and yet the geologic record shows us that there were planktonic cells all the way back to 3.5 billion years ago. And that really tells us that the organisms doing photosynthesis in the water column in early oceans are mostly extinct. And so what we see today is not things that have simply accumulated through 3 billion years, but things that have outcompeted and replaced ones that were there earlier in Earth history. For eukaryotes, it's a lot easier because we have a lot more morphology that's distinct from anything we see today. So all of these are fossils of organisms that lived between 800 and 1,500 million years ago. All of these species are extinct. So once we start getting nucleated cells, protozoa and algae, they start to show this pattern of turnover as we see in the record of plants and animals. And indeed, there's at least one moment around 716 million years ago when much of that evolved diversity disappears. It's at a time of the largest ice age the world has ever seen, and it is an example of a true mass extinction before the age of animals. And then finally, even in the earliest record of animals, there is evidence that mass extinction may be shaping evolutionary history. If we look right around what's called the Precambrian-Cambrian boundary, about 541 million years ago, beneath that boundary, that is in rocks of the so-called Ediacaran period, what we see in a record of animals is very unusual structures. Most of these fossils are very difficult to actually interpret in terms of the body plans of animals that we know well today. Essentially, all of those go extinct at or near this boundary, and after that, we start seeing the diversification of more familiar organisms. This is a picture of a trilobite taken by Bruce Lieberman, and it's just telling us that something separates the world of familiar animals, which start to radiate in the Cambrian, from the world of these archaic animals that dominated ecosystems in the preceding period. And it may actually be that early animal evolution was also shaped by mass extinction. So, just to conclude then, death and extinction have been woven into the fabric of life and evolution since the beginning. It's very difficult to contemplate life without death. It is very difficult to contemplate evolution without extinction. And that mass extinction, which plays a differentially important role in shaping the fabric of evolution through time, apparently was not only present shaping the record of plants and animals over the last 500 million years, but actually was a phenomenon of importance before that, so that extinction itself and mass extinction have probably been influencing the course of evolution for much of Earth history. Thank you very much.
Bien, muchas gracias, doctor Knoll, por su presentación. Lo que vamos a hacer ahora, en lo que termina el doctor Lieberman de instalar su computadora, es escuchar de él cómo son los grandes patrones de extinciones que vemos. Andy Knoll ya nos ha mostrado cómo uno puede efectivamente recorrer la historia de la biosfera en el planeta como una historia, como una narrativa en donde surgen y desaparecen grandes grupos biológicos. Algunos de esos grupos nos han dejado huellas que son perfectamente visibles. Esto puede ser analizado cuantitativamente y en realidad el doctor Lieberman pertenece ya a ese grupo de paleobiólogos que haciendo uso de técnicas estadísticas, técnicas de análisis matemático, técnicas morfológicas, han podido reconstruir las oleadas de extinciones, el surgimiento de nuevos grupos y ha podido también demostrar cómo esto se puede analizar desde una óptica filogenética, haciendo usos de otros marcadores moleculares, otros marcadores morfológicos distintos a los que acabamos de ver. Como ya mencioné, él está en el Departamento de Biología Evolutiva y Ecología de la Universidad de Kansas y pues es para mí un placer cederle la palabra. Bruce.
Thank you very much, Antonio. It's a real pleasure to be here in this beautiful facility and also in this amazing metropolis, so I really appreciate the introduction. Today I'm going to talk about chance and predictability in the history of life. And really what I mean by that is one of the things that we recognize as paleontologists and evolutionary biologists is that everything dies. But what we try to do as scientists is try to predict what dies and when it will die, and also understand what might cause things to die. Now, on a personal level, when I pensar la muerte, my thoughts somewhat resemble the weird Hollywood filmmaker who remarked that he didn't want to achieve immortality through his work. He wanted to achieve it by not dying. But apparently from the earlier cell biology talks, that just won't be possible. So I'll transition into the more scientific aspects of pensar la muerte. And the fact of the matter is, because of a variety of reasons, including some of the phenomena that Dr. Knoll talked about that I will discuss in some additional detail, our ability to predict what will die and when it will die is not that good, in fact. And maybe we shouldn't be surprised by that, because predictive theories about the evolution, at least of human societies, have largely been disproven. Freud's ideas, Marx's ideas are no longer accepted. This is my favorite Marx brother. I like Harpo a lot too, but Groucho. And partly the reason that is the case is well described in the work of Stephen Jay Gould when he introduced the phenomenon of contingency based on studies by a variety of scientists who examined fossils from the Burgess Shale, and this is one of these fossils shown here, and he argued that to a great extent, chance rules the history of life. And I think Gould is largely right, but there are some important caveats that I also want to talk about today. Now, I will say that Richard Dawkins has argued that evolution is generally predictable. However, Richard Dawkins has been proved wrong by a variety of sources, including the boys from South Park, and I will not consider him any further in this talk. So, to reconsider Gould's ideas on predictability and evolution, I don't want you to think that evolutionary biologists entirely lack the ability to predict evolutionary change. For instance, it is well recognized that if you take a certain type of species, for example, this bird that remarkably resembles one of Darwin's finches, and then these birds are able to fly to islands some distance away, given enough time, we know that they'll change. We don't necessarily know in what way they will change, but this is one aspect where I think we need to revisit this notion from Gould that chance rules the history of life. In order to do this, I want to talk about some case studies deriving from my work, and I'm going to focus on 3 different case studies. First, I want to talk about the role of random walks in the history of life and how we can compare the history of life to a random phenomenon. And I think it's very important at any stage when you're looking at a scientific hypothesis, for example, the hypothesis, why do things change through time? Why has life become more diverse? And why have various extinctions happened? And what may be their causes? We always need to compare changes through time to a random walk phenomenon. And the reason can partly be demonstrated by looking at this series of random walks shown here, where you just allow a value to change either positively or negatively through time. Simply over time, things can change a lot at random. For example, this light blue lineage here ends up at pretty far away from its original value of 0, but that's not for any reason. It wasn't like this light blue lineage wanted to end up there. It just ended up there at random. So one of the things that we do recognize when we study the fossil record is that the total number of species on this planet has increased through time. But we'd like to know why. In particular, is it a process that's largely random? Is it a trend that's passive? Or is it governed by more active processes or phenomena? And to look at this question allows us to gain greater insights into the types of phenomena that might be driving evolutionary change. And here's a series of diagrams which for the purposes of this talk, we can just treat as a bunch of squiggles. But essentially what these squiggles imply is that when you look at the record of extinction, origination, and diversity over the last about 500 million years, statistically they cannot be distinguished from a random walk phenomenon. So what does that mean? Well, it means that at least at the grand scale, although that trajectory, we can't distinguish it statistically from a random walk, we could take that as implying that evolution is a process that largely proceeds at random. And that is one possible interpretation. But I'd like to pose at least a couple of other alternatives. It might be, for instance, that there are so many different processes that influence the way evolution happens that effectively they all cancel out or operate in complex ways or manifest themselves in complex ways such that the net result appears to be random. And I think that is a legitimate hypothesis that could be accepted from this result. But I think there's another potential hypothesis that I'd like to at least argue for in a bit greater detail, and that might be that maybe life itself is tracking a variable that largely follows a random walk pattern. And one of the variables, and it ties in nicely with what Dr. Knoll was talking about earlier, that seems to closely mirror the changes in time in terms of patterns of extinction and also the appearance of new lineages as well, and also overall diversity, is levels of carbon dioxide, which have been modeled through time. And if you look at the appearance of new species, as well as their disappearance, and the overall implied levels of carbon dioxide, there's a very good fit between the two. And further, when you look at that change through time in carbon dioxide, it largely follows a random walk trajectory. Now, what does this mean? I don't think that carbon dioxide necessarily is the variable that life is tracking, but it is closely tracking something that carbon dioxide is a proxy for, and that is temperature. And because of this, we can therefore make predictions about how climate changes have in the past influenced the disappearance of life, and how in the future they will affect such changes as well, such that, again, although evolution largely follows a random walk, it does illustrate aspects of predictability. I want to take that even a step further, just briefly talk about some of the research that I've done to look at what might be the effects of climate change over the next 100 years or so. And I especially focused on marine organisms. I study those both fossil marine organisms, but also modern ones, and we can use climate projections to predict what will happen to species over the course of the next 100 years. And in fact, you can see for a variety of species of clams and also snails, that what will happen as climate changes, that you'll see dramatic reductions in the ranges of species. It so happens that each of these species does at present have a prominent distribution along the eastern coast of Mexico and the Gulf of Mexico, and over the next 100 years, that distribution will largely be lost. And it turns out that many of the species that this will happen to are species that, in fact, our own species depends on for food. So there are predictions. Sometimes these predictions aren't necessarily ones that we'd like to hear, but it will allow us potentially to use the fossil record to modify, hopefully, our behavior. So to move on to my second case study, mass extinctions, as Dr. Knoll talked about, are one of the fundamental features of the history of life. And to come back to this point that I made about how extinction largely follows a random walk through time, it's partly because there are random phenomena, random major changes in the environment that occur that organisms cannot possibly prepare for, and therefore they're usually unable to adapt and die. One of the types of phenomena that I want to talk about in particular is we need to consider not only the types of environmental changes that occur on this planet, but environmental changes in the broader solar system and galaxy as well. It turns out that at times, there are very large explosions of stars. In this case, what I'm showing you is a video of a gamma ray burst here. And these explosions are happening in stars, thankfully, usually very far away. But they release amounts of energy equivalent to all of the light in the universe concentrated into 10 seconds. So there was a talk earlier today about supernova, which do release tremendous amounts of energy. But gamma ray bursts probably release at least 100 times the amount of energy. And when you talk to physicists and cosmologists, they can in fact model how frequently a gamma ray burst should happen in our galactic vicinity. And at least once in the last billion years, there should have been a gamma ray burst in our galactic vicinity. In fact, we know that such a gamma ray burst was not too close to the surface of this solar system, because it would have literally incinerated our entire atmosphere and the surface of the planet. However, close enough for a gamma ray burst still would be within about 6,000 light years. Now, one of the phenomena that we associate with the gamma ray burst is the release of a tremendous amount of gamma ray radiation. And probably the biological effects of gamma radiation are well known to many of you in the audience. For example, some of you may be familiar with Dr. Bruce Banner and the Incredible Hulk, which also was revisited by famous Italian-American actor Lou Ferrigno in the live-action series The Hulk in the 1970s. It is even possible that professional wrestler Hulk Hogan may be a manifestation of elevated rates of gamma radiation. And finally, you know who may be explained by this as well. And I should say that, Antonio, this is one of those pictures that I don't have permission to use. I'm sorry about that. But in all reality, the biggest thing we needed to worry about gamma ray bursts, thank you, the biggest things we needed to worry about gamma ray bursts, when they're far enough away to not incinerate the surface of this planet, is the effects that they would cause on our planet's atmosphere, both allowing a dramatic increase in the amount of ultraviolet radiation and also potentially leading to a lot of global cooling as well. And it turns out that at least in the case of one of the mass extinctions in the last 500 million years or so, the mass extinction at the end of the late Ordovician, which dramatically influenced this group, the trilobites, some of the patterns that we see in extinction in these and other groups at the end of the Ordovician match the type of patterns that we would predict to see given the environmental changes that a gamma ray burst should wreak on our planet. So to come back to this issue that I started my talk with regarding Stephen Jay Gould and his ideas on evolution and predictability, where I think he's absolutely right, and Professor Knoll amplified this as well too, is that because there are these catastrophic events that periodically confront life and often involve environmental changes that happen even beyond our solar system, there's no way that organisms can literally or figuratively see them coming. They cannot evolve or adapt to survive them. And because of that, effectively, large numbers of species will be eliminated in what we might call random or chance reasons. That might just be because they're at the wrong place or the wrong time, or they didn't have the types of traits that would allow them to survive during this interval. So I would say that one of the things that mass extinction does is introduces a major element of chance into the history of life. So now, to transition into my the last part of my talk, what I want to tie together here, or try to tie together here, is how there are certain patterns that we see in the evolution of species in the fossil record that also match the patterns that we see in the stock market and changes through time in the stock market, and finally the changes through time that we see in the stars in our universe. And really one of the things that I want to focus on is that there are certain things that were once common that are no longer prevalent. For example, there used to be sensible Republican politicians in the United States of America. Here's a good example here, John Lindsay, former mayor of New York City. There also used to be talented actors in science fiction series, but alas, these two are no longer present in the United States of America. And I should say that one of the most important things that I focus on that are no longer present are the trilobites. And to avoid being too trilocentric, I also want to include and give a nod to other organisms like the ammonites. Why are trilobites and ammonites no longer with us? And I think the traditional Darwinian argument was that for some reason there was something about trilobites or ammonites that made them less fit, or less competitively fit to survive in the long term. And I want to revisit that view, and in fact also try to convince you guys that maybe this does allow an additional element of predictability in the history of life. And what things like trilobites and ammonites share in common is that they happen to have a specific characteristic of what I refer to as high volatility. And what I mean by that is that paradoxically they happen to have high rates of evolution. So we might not think this, but it turns out that it is those groups that have the highest rates of evolution that are the ones that are least likely to survive in the long term. Well, just as we can see certain types of species that have high rates of evolutionary change, well, there are also certain types of stocks that happen to change in their price more rapidly than others. And finally, there are certain types of stars that are more likely to explode than others. And what I'm going to try and convince you of is the fact that things that are more volatile, that are more likely to change, in fact, in the long term, are less likely to survive. And the reason why that's the case is because they're not stable. And again, this might seem a bit counterintuitive, but in an evolutionary sense, and also in a stock market sense, and an astrophysical sense, change makes you susceptible to disappearing through time. So first I want to start out with a graph that just shows the appearance and disappearance of species of fossils through time. And basically what's happened over the last 550 million years, if we concentrate on animals, especially animals that we see in the oceans, what we find is the species that evolve rapidly have dramatically decreased through time. So back in the early history of animals, there were relatively high rates of evolution. And through time, those rates declined. And in fact, that pattern is statistically significant as well. Why is that the case? Well, it turns out partly things that evolve at a rapid rate are also more likely to go extinct at a high rate. The things that make them more likely to evolve also make them more likely to go extinct. And ultimately, that makes those things more likely to fall to a diversity value of 0. And once you reach diversity, to follow the conservationist mantra, extinction is forever. So you can't recover from that point. And once they disappear, they're not replaced. So there's some statement, I think, in the Bible, though I don't know my Bible very well, but it's something like, the worms will inherit the earth, or maybe that's the meek. I'm not exactly sure. But anyways, the best evolutionary strategy is the worm strategy, because they have remarkably low rates of evolution. In the long term, it's better to be a worm than a trilobite or an ammonite, or probably even a primate like our species. Well, let's move on to stocks. In reality, people have looked at this issue of volatility in stocks for a very long time. They haven't looked at it in paleontology for a very long time, and that's because they can't make much money doing it. But if anybody would like to donate to me, I'd be glad to visit with you afterwards. But in the stock market, when people talk about rates of change in the prices of stocks, in fact, there's a metric that is used, and it's a term called beta. And for a very long time, there was a view which is referred to as the CAPM, or Capital Asset Pricing Model. And it basically posited that if you want to make a lot of money, you've got to risk a lot. The view was the greater the risk, the greater for reward. And this was an investment strategy that had been endorsed for many decades. Let's look at how this investment strategy fares. Here is a set of stock values corrected for inflation between 1968 and 2008, looking at the weekly price of stocks, and it's been divided up by beta. That is, those things that are the most variable have the highest beta, the things that change their prices the most. Those things that change the least have the lowest beta. And what happens is that the things that change the least are colored here in pink. And if you invested $1 in those stocks in 1968, adjusted for inflation, you would have had $10.28 in 2008. And I'm no financial analyst, but I think that's a pretty good rate of return of investment. By contrast, if you invested in those stocks that showed the greatest amount of variability, that is, if you did what the capital asset pricing model told you to do, after 40 years, adjusted for inflation, if you invested $1, you'd end up with 64 cents. And it doesn't take a paleontology professor to tell you that that's a bad investment strategy. Now, why is it that these stocks that show this greater rate of change don't do well in the long term? And really, not doing well in the long term in terms of price for a stock is very much akin to not doing well evolutionarily in the long term if you're a species or a group of species. Well, the thing that most negatively affected groups like trilobites and also ammonites is that they were very susceptible to mass extinctions. And this partly comes back to the issue of volatility. Recall that I said that these are groups that have high rates of evolution and also extinction. Well, basically what a mass extinction is a dramatic increase in the probability of extinction. So if you're a group that during normal times has a high rate of extinction, and suddenly you come into a time with a very high rate of extinction, you're much more likely mathematically to disappear. And that's why trilobites and ammonites are no longer with us. During most times evolutionarily, things were fine for them. But during times of dramatic change, what we call mass extinctions, mathematically the odds were against them. And once they were gone forever. And a very similar phenomenon emerges with stocks. What I've mapped on here are not mass extinctions, but the financial equivalent of mass extinctions. These are the major crashes or crises in the stock market over the last 40 years. Notice that they occur in 1981 and 1987. That's twice during the Reagan administration. He was not one of those sensible Republican politicians that I was talking about. Is that acceptable to say here, Antonio? And you can see that these lineages of stocks do very well except during the time of financial crises. The next financial crisis is the crisis after 9/11, where there's a huge drop-off in the stock market. And finally, the crisis in 2007, after Lehman Brothers went effectively extinct. And what you can see is that the low beta or low volatility stocks sail right through these mass extinctions or financial crises. Work with me here. By contrast, the things that vary a lot in price during the time of crises get hit really hard. Other times they do pretty well, but during a time of crises, which sadly is generally unpredictable, just like a mass extinction, they get hit really hard. So if you want to bet your money, the best things to do, I should say that I will not be responsible for any financial advice that goes awry, and I'm pretty far away from you guys, so don't blame me though if this doesn't work out, right? It's just a talk, really. But you want to put your money on the low volatility stocks, just like you want to in the long term put your money evolutionarily on those species that have low volatility. And I should say that there's a lot of differences between stocks and groups of species or taxa. Stocks don't really speciate, except if you talk about stock splitting. And most of the time, paleontologists analyze taxa, they're looking at genera, which aren't even species anyways. There's also a phenomenon that emerged, at least most recently in 2007. I don't know if you guys had to deal with this in Mexico, but certain companies were deemed in the United States too big to fail. What that meant is that when their stock price went to zero, Andy and my tax dollars went to prop them up to make sure, because it was assumed that if they did fail, it would have really bad consequences for us. Further, because there are lots of people in the stock market who like to gamble, that is to say, there are lots of suckers, there are always these new stocks which change at a very high rate that stockbrokers try to sell to people. But even though there are these differences, the same basic pattern holds in stocks as in species. So finally, let's move on to stars. What I'm showing you here, and the time axis is reversed from right to left as opposed to left to right. We and physicists have to get on the same page with this. I'm sorry, but I hope it will still serve. So remember, in my paleontological diagrams, time went this way to this way. Well, it goes the opposite way. But basically, this is a graph of very early in the history of the universe to the present, the overall rate of the formation of stars, and it also turns out the overall rate of the explosion or extinction of stars has diminished through time. So yes, it is true, there are still mommy stars today, like Angelina Jolie, and this cluster of stars in this nebula here. However, the overall rate of star formation and star explosion has declined through time. Why is this the case? Because explosive stars, once they explode, are gone, just like species that go extinct. Further, as new stars form, they remove the gas really from around them that would allow other stars to form. Basically, our universe through time has become more boring, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It has in fact made our solar system and the rest of the universe a safer place to live. You don't want to be living near to places where there's lots of exploding gamma rays and other phenomena as well. So what do fossil stocks and stars share in common? One of the things that they all share in common is that they are all historical entities. And this kind of brings me back to the phenomenon that Gould described as contingency. The more volatile the historical entity is, the more likely it's to reach a point of no return. In life, that's extinction. In stocks, that's bankruptcy. And in stars, that's explosion. And stocks are especially at risk during times of financial crises. Species are especially at risk during times of mass extinction. And stars were especially at risk early in the history of our universe. So I think that there are general principles in biology that allow us to make predictions. And this is not, of course, the first one. Scientists have recognized this for a very long time. For example, Galileo described how basic principles of shape and size governed the formation of bones and other things back in the 17th century. But why these are important to document is it shows that there are certain structural constraints on the pathway of evolution. The traditional Darwinian explanations that might emphasize adaptation and competition, I don't want to say that they're completely wrong, of course they're not, but they're incomplete. There are certain things about life forms that make them more likely or less likely to survive through time that have nothing to do with how fit or how well adapted they are. So what I've tried to talk about today is that things can show contingent behavior. That is to say, they're historical, but maybe the fact that they're historical allows us to make predictions about them. So it kind of turns this notion, or I try to turn this notion of contingency on its head. History can allow prediction. I will admit that on the whole, evolution is largely unpredictable. But you can go to places like the beautiful Azore Islands here, and you're guaranteed to find distinctive species because it's an isolated island. Further, you can go back and look at rocks from the Cambrian period 500 million years ago, and you can either be out there in the field or looking at the fossils in those rocks and see the predominant role that the environment plays, either because you know you have to get over this mountain range and oh no, there's a storm coming, or you can look at the trilobites inside of those rocks and see how much of an influence environmental change has had through time on life forms. So just to conclude, I'd like to thank these people. I'd especially like to thank Dr. Antonio Lazcano, who's an amazing individual and scientist, and it's really a privilege to get to meet you again after our time in the Galapagos, and I'd also like to thank these funding agencies as well. So thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Bien, ¿se oye o?
There we go.
No. No. ¿Se oye bien ahí? No. ¿Sí? Okay, sí, ya. ¿Me escuchan bien ustedes? No.
That's more or less on.
Sí, ahora sí. Muchas gracias. Bien, tenemos tiempo para comentarios, preguntas, críticas, intercambios. Y yo sí quisiera comenzar agradeciendo desde luego tanto al doctor Knoll como al doctor Lieberman sus presentaciones, que son, para quienes trabajamos en biología evolutiva, extraordinariamente originales, reseñan una serie de fenómenos a los que todos estamos habituados, pero hay algo que me gustaría decir antes de ceder la palabra a quienes quieran participar, y es que en una imagen incorrecta pero muy extendida de la evolución biológica, se suele creer que las poblaciones, que las especies, que los organismos en general son entidades pasivas ante los cambios del ambiente. Y uno de los grandes cambios que ha habido en la historia del planeta, probablemente el cambio más grande después del origen de la vida, fue la transformación de la atmósfera del planeta, de un planeta donde no había oxígeno libre, un planeta donde la atmósfera era, si no reductora, cuando menos anóxica, a un cuerpo en donde la cantidad de oxígeno es absolutamente abrumadora, producto de la fotosíntesis, producto de la evolución biológica, y el oxígeno en la atmósfera provocó una serie de cambios enormes, no solo en los sedimentos, empezaron a depositarse una serie de elementos oxidados, una serie de minerales nuevos, provocó cambios enormes, por ejemplo, en la acidez de los océanos, provocó cambios extraordinarios en la temperatura promedio del planeta y en sitios locales. Y a su vez, los seres vivos reaccionamos ante ese cambio ambiental tan extraordinario con una serie de cambios biológicos adicionales. Para mencionar un caso concreto, el doctor Knoll mencionaba el colesterol. La biosíntesis del colesterol es una ruta metabólica que depende del oxígeno libre. Si no tenemos oxígeno libre no hay colesterol, y aunque el colesterol tiene una pésima fama, especialmente en un país tan chicharronero como el nuestro, cabe recordar que necesitamos colesterol para tener membranas más flexibles, más resistentes, y eso es lo que permitió un nuevo tipo de célula, que son las células nucleadas, las células eucariontes, en donde los procesos de simbiosis y provocaron un tipo de evolución, o muestran un tipo de evolución que en modo alguno tiene que ver con esa caricatura simplista de la evolución como un proceso de supervivencia o competencia como el más fuerte. Yo quisiera que tuvieran esto en mente, que la biosfera no es en modo alguno una entidad pasiva ante los cambios ambientales, sino que hemos jugado un papel extraordinariamente activo cambiando las condiciones del planeta, y una vez que esas condiciones cambian, eso a su vez provoca una serie de cambios en la biosfera, y el resultado es una especie de diálogo tan intenso que a veces cuesta mucho trabajo distinguir a los interlocutores. Esos fueron cambios mayúsculos, provocaron extinciones sin duda alguna, provocaron la aparición de nuevos grupos biológicos, y creo que con esto en mente podemos sí comenzar con las preguntas. Por favor.
Buenas tardes. Bueno, yo tengo dos dudas, dos preguntas. En la plática del profesor Lieberman, él explicaba que la extinción de los trilobites y los amonites se debía a que habían sido más evolucionados, manejó el término de volatilidad, pero mi duda es si decimos que los trilobites y los amonites fueron los más evolucionados, ¿no se supondría que como más evolucionados son más tendientes a sobrevivir? Tomando en cuenta el postulado de la teoría de la evolución. Esa es mi primera pregunta. Y la segunda es específicamente para usted, doctor Lazcano. Bueno, Darwin, refiriéndose al registro fósil, dijo que no se apoyaba tanto en él porque no estaba completo cuando escribió El origen. Pero, ¿por qué cree usted que no consideró a los microorganismos, ¿no? que pudieron haber reforzado todo su cúmulo de apoyos teóricos, ¿no? en sus ideas? Esas son mis dos preguntas. Gracias.
No, please.
Those are both excellent questions. So just to focus, sorry, let me just take these off because I'm easily distracted. When I hear my own words translated, I can't. And the translator is doing such an excellent job. I really appreciate that. As a New Yorker, I'm often told that I talk too fast, and I can't help it. And never once did the translator ask me to slow down, and I really appreciate that. So to come back to this issue of volatility, this is an excellent point, and I think it does go against the way evolution is traditionally presented. And the way I'd like you to think about it, you don't have to accept my argument, but there's two things or a few things that come with having a high origination rate or high speciation rate. The things that make things more likely to speciate is usually that they have a very small geographic range. They become more isolated, like the slides I showed of Darwin's finches. Though the finches actually don't really show that, but I think my slide did. So they become more easily isolated, they're more likely to speciate. But they also, by having this predilection to isolation and a small population size, are also more likely to go extinct. We don't worry about the rat going extinct because it occurs everywhere, but that butterfly that occurs in a tiny place in Mexico is much more susceptible to changes. So, and there's a very strong correlation between origination rate, speciation rate, and extinction rate. So I'd like you to think that at least one of the reasons that makes trilobites more susceptible is because they evolve quickly, they go extinct quickly. But another reason I'd like you to think about this issue is the traditional view of evolution was that we would look at lineages through time and how they changed. And our views on evolution have changed a lot, partly because of my undergraduate advisor and my graduate advisor, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge, who developed the ideas that today are referred to as punctuated equilibria. That once a species evolves, it doesn't change much. So it's not so much that they have a high rate of lineage evolution, they're just more likely to become isolated and form new species. So once they evolve, they're mostly stable, but they become isolated at a faster rate, which makes them more prone to speciate, but also more prone to go extinct. I hope that it somewhat answers your question.
Bueno, respecto a la segunda pregunta, Darwin se refirió a los microbios cuando hizo la biografía de su abuelo Erasmus, que era un médico que había estudiado en la Universidad de Edimburgo, que era una universidad laica, aunque no les guste a algunos que son nuestros vecinos en este barrio, era una universidad en donde las ideas de la Ilustración francesa circulaban libremente, donde no había que estar ordenado para ser como sacerdote, como predicador, para ser profesor. Y Erasmus Darwin, que tenía un espíritu extraordinariamente inquieto, habla de los microbios, por lo que dice Charles Darwin en la biografía, de los microbios como organismos de una ubicuidad extraordinaria cuyo papel biológico será bien comprendido en el futuro. Ahora, cuando Darwin fue estudiante no muy bueno en esa universidad, terminó básicamente huyendo de allí al cabo de unos cuantos meses, la microbiología no era parte del programa de estudios de los médicos. Y de hecho sabemos que cuando se fue a Cambridge, un amigo que eventualmente se convirtió en un juez muy famoso, le dejó un día en sus habitaciones de regalo un paquetito que contenía un microscopio. Y la carta de Darwin, cuando eventualmente varios años después descubre quién se lo da, es de una gratitud enorme porque dice: me has permitido introducirme a un mundo absolutamente insospechado. El mundo insospechado eran básicamente insectos. Darwin no le llamó la atención enormemente los microorganismos. Ahora, si ustedes se fijan en los tiempos, resulta que cuando Darwin estaba estudiando y cuando era estudiante en medicina, de medicina, la idea de los gérmenes como tal era un término que no había sido acuñado. Darwin publica su libro famoso, el más famoso, El origen de las especies, en 1859, y los experimentos de Pasteur por un lado en Francia, de Robert Koch en Alemania por otro lado, son experimentos que se hacen apenas un par de años atrás. De suerte que para Darwin los microorganismos no entraban en su imagen general de la diversidad de la biosfera. Sabemos que recogió unas muestras de polvo ricas en microorganismos cuando estuvo en el Beagle. Esas muestras las envió a Inglaterra, se analizaron apenas en el 2009, aprovechando el centenario de Darwin, se pudieron caracterizar los microorganismos que estaban allí, pero Darwin no tenía los elementos bioquímicos para teñir las membranas, para observar en detalle, y básicamente le preocupaban otro tipo de microorganismos. Creo que aquí es importante enfatizar algo que algunos sabemos. El fundador real de la paleontología del Precámbrico fue Elso Barhorn de la Universidad de Harvard, que tuvo un alumno excepcional, que fue precisamente Andrew Knoll. Y por uno de esos casos rarísimos en la historia de las universidades estadounidenses, aunque Andy era egresado de la Universidad de Harvard, pudo regresar allí y heredar el laboratorio de Knoll. De hecho, con Knoll, con Barhorn, se establece finalmente el reconocimiento de la riqueza del registro fósil del Precámbrico y del Fanerozoico en términos de los microorganismos. ¿Es that fair?
Sounds good to me.
Hola. Bueno, yo tengo dos preguntas. La primera es para Lieberman. Me gusta mucho el concepto de volatilidad porque siento que unifica bien tanto la contingencia como la constricción. Pero mi pregunta era, ¿cómo podemos cuantificar la volatilidad? Y si eso podría ir como por una onda de evolvability sensu evo devo. así de, por ejemplo, por constricción ontogenética o qué tipo de constricción, ¿no? Porque a fin de cuentas, pues eso es súper revelador, que tenemos una ciencia aparentemente estocástica, que es la evolución, pero que tú puedes más o menos forzar por medio de constricciones, ¿no? Y bueno, la otra pregunta es para Knoll, y es que, ¿cómo considera en esta historia de pues de las formas microscópicas del precámbrico a los putativos embriones de Doshuanto, ¿no? Que a veces no se mencionan tanto? Bueno, espero haberlo pronunciado bien, pero, o sea, que si piensa que son embriones o qué son, ¿no? Esos microfósiles.
You want to start?
Okay, I'll answer the more straightforward question first. One of the things, as Antonio mentioned, we are still in an explorational phase of trying to understand the first 3 billion years of life's history on the Earth, and so that our ideas change with new discoveries. And the discovery that was mentioned in particular is there are some rocks in China that are about 570 to 580 million years old that are made up predominantly of mineral phosphate, something that only rarely accumulates to form ore bodies. But the paleontological dividend that comes from studying these phosphates is that this mineral has preserved microorganisms of various types probably better than any other instance of microbial fossilization that we actually know from the geologic record. So in addition to various types of cyanobacteria and protists, there are multicellular algae with tissues, particularly red algae, and there's a particular set of populations that look very much like what we would expect to see if we had a fertilized egg that would then divide into a number of cells the way animal embryos do. So when we first found them, and my former student Shuhai Shao really did most of the work, we actually interpreted them as the early stage cleavage embryos of primitive animals. And that's because these are so simple, but other people have had other ideas. I must say that I'm actually quite taken when you actually look at embryogenesis in a very deeply branching group of living animals called placozoans. They very much look in some detail like the cleavage pattern that we see in those fossils. And so that, and the fact that these are sometimes found within spore or cyst-like structures that are very, very similar to structures made by so-called diapause cysts in animals, and very different from structures known to be made by algae, I still think, with some uncertainty, that those fossils are probably early cleavage stage embryos of animals, early branching animals, perhaps even extinct groups of animals.
Thank you very much for the good words on the volatility hypothesis. And I think you actually raise a number of good points. So the way I was defining volatility was only in terms of, I was quantifying it by adding the speciation rate and the extinction rate and dividing it by the total diversity present in the group. But I do think, so you talked about the possibility of looking at embryological or developmental volatility, and I would bet that there is probably, it could be done at a cellular level, but my suspicion would be that you'd find similar types of patterns and that it would be an excellent place to investigate. I even wonder at the molecular level if there are certain types of pathways that might show greater degrees of entropy. I don't know if that would be the appropriate measure, that might be less likely to persist in the long term, whereas those that did not wouldn't. So I would think that there are lots of other areas where this could be investigated, and I think could also be quantified. And I think, especially when we're looking at the history of life, it is really important to quantify things so that we can test them statistically and consider rigorous hypotheses, because sometimes that's not always done in paleontology, and I think it's important. So I would very much think that that would be something that could be done in development too.
Buenas tardes, buenas noches. Maestro Lazcano, ahora sí, por favor, me apoyo apelando en su gran disponibilidad y comprensión como biólogo y oriundo de esta hermosa tierra para hacerme entender en el idioma de Shakespeare que ni lo dije, bueno, no lo digiero y lo tartamudeo mucho. Haciendo un parangón, maestro Lazcano, hace rato en la versión anterior, en la sesión anterior, yo me ubicaba, soy gente de provincia, ahorita con toda la magnífica información me hace apelar otra vez a un refrán que dicen por ahí, ¿por qué conviene tener dos velas prendidas? Viene al caso por esto, maestro, de toda la descripción que nos han dicho de la existencia de las otras especies, que entre más alta es sus características de vida pueden vivir menos, la pregunta concreta sería, en esta etapa que nos tocó vivir, en este hermoso planeta, plantas y animales, nuestra característica de lateralidad, la bilateralidad, nos puede servir de una cosa favorable para que la especie con tal característica perdure un poco más, a diferencia de las otras que no la tenían. Gracias, maestro Lazcano.
Muchas gracias por su pregunta. Lo primero que quisiera decir es que como biólogo, y creo que aquí hablo por todos los que están cercanos a esa disciplina, la idea de que podemos dividir la biosfera en dos grandes grupos es una idea que hemos abandonado radicalmente. Plantas y animales es una división que refleja una visión taxonómica del mundo perfectamente legítima. Un ejemplo que a mí me gusta poner mucho en mis clases es los mercados. Si ustedes van a los mercados se van a dar cuenta que muy claramente los marchantes tienen divididos a las plantas de un lado, a los animales del otro. En la sección de productos cárnicos están siempre los productos de cerdo, los productos de res, separados de los pollos, de las gallinas y separados a su vez de los productos del mar. Los peces están agrupados cerca pero no revueltos con los mariscos, por ejemplo. Si se va uno a las plantas, uno se da cuenta que allí hay una división también muy visible. La gente pone las verduras lejos de las frutas y el gran error taxonómico que uno descubre en un mercado es que los hongos están puestos siempre junto con las plantas. El grupo biológico más cercano a los animales, y esto lo digo no por molestar a los vegetarianos, sino porque es una realidad evolutiva, son precisamente los hongos. Cuando un vegetariano consume hongos con la mayor tranquilidad, está comiendo lo más cercano a una vaca que se puede encontrar. Esto lo digo a propósito de la corrección política que nos empieza a invadir lamentablemente. Bueno, los biólogos se dieron cuenta desde el siglo XIX, cuando empezaron a usar microscopios, que de una manera muy intensa, con Haeckel en especial, que en realidad los microorganismos constituían un grupo con características muy peculiares, y como esto se hace en el momento de la expansión imperialista de Europa, de manera muy natural, así como se creó el reino de Grecia o el imperio mexicano, pues se creó el reino de los protistas. Y ahí surge una característica muy peculiar que ahí me gustaría comentar. Dentro del reino de los protistas, Haeckel agrupó a las bacterias en un grupo con fronteras muy cambiantes que llamó monera, donde ahora están lo que llamamos bacterias y lo que también llamamos las arqueas, un tipo particular de procarionte. Si ustedes se fijan, hay una enorme diversidad en los organismos nucleados. O sea, podemos ser bilaterales, como nosotros, con una simetría bilateral, podemos ser como las diatomeas, podemos ser como las amibas, podemos ser como los champiñones, Pero cuando nos vamos a los procariontes, cuando nos vamos a los monera, lo que nosotros vemos es que la diversidad no es morfológica, sino metabólica. No existe ningún grupo biológico con una mayor diversidad metabólica que los procariontes. Entonces, yo lo que le quisiera preguntar a ambos ponentes es si puedo yo medir esa diversidad a nivel de procariontes en el registro fósil, porque claramente cuando me asomo a los protistas veo morfologías muy específicas. Tenemos una idea de cómo era la diversidad de las bacterias en esas etapas iniciales y medias del precámbrico, y esto coincide con estas imágenes de un grupo extraordinariamente estable que morfológicamente no ha cambiado y metabólicamente son muy conservadores.
Yeah, I'll try that for the Precambrian. And I think when we find fossils of prokaryotic organisms in very ancient rocks, nearly all of them are with some confidence identifiable as belonging to one particular group of bacteria called the cyanobacteria. And there are several reasons for that. One is that relative to other bacteria, cyanobacteria tend to be large. They tend to have more complex morphologies, at least many of them do, than other types of bacteria, and most of them make a cell envelope or covering that is actually somewhat resistant to decay. And so for these reasons of both preservability, size, and specificity in size and shape, we can recognize a record of cyanobacteria pretty well. That said, we know very little about many other groups. Now, there's reasons to want to know about cyanobacteria because this is the only group ever to evolve the capacity to use water as an electron donor for photosynthesis. And the consequence of that is that oxygen gas, O2, is produced as a byproduct. Now, you might say, but there's a tree outside here doing the same thing. But what you have to understand is if you look in the leaf of that tree, the cells that are photosynthesizing have a little organelle called a chloroplast, and chloroplasts originated as free-living cyanobacteria that were taken into as symbiotic organisms, eukaryotic organisms, and were essentially reduced to metabolic slavery. So in a sense, we know a lot about the group we most want to know about and very little about other groups.
I think, Antonio, you raise a number of really interesting points. The one I'd like to focus on, so I think there's all types of interesting issues involved with changes in cell types through time, and those are fascinating evolutionary topics. The one thing I do want to emphasize is sort of one of the major evolutionary changes, in addition to the origins of life, is a transition that Lynn Margulis really focused on with the development of the eukaryotic cell. And I think that that transition is really a profound one that had amazing consequences evolutionarily because it allowed for an increase in the rate of variability. So I definitely would never argue that there was nothing going on before that. There are lots of fascinating things, especially with metabolism and physiology, but it's that event which also doesn't involve the simple evolutionary principle of competition so much, but more cooperation that triggered this event. Yes, cooperation may have given a competitive advantage to those organisms, but it is ultimately about cooperation. And it's that increase in the potential for evolutionary variation that triggers the change from what we might call more simple, though still arguably the most successful things on Earth, to more complex things. That transition was sparked for reasons that led to greater variability. And also, I'd like to lament the fact that every time I see myself on this TV screen, I look amazingly white and incredibly bald. So I don't know what's happened, but I feel like I'm simplifying through time.
You know, getting away from your baldness for a moment, I think one other
Thank
thing...
you, I'll buy you a beer for that.
One thing to say about this cooperative relationship that we see in the origin of the mitochondria and chloroplasts in eukaryotic cells, it would be a mistake to think that that's something that happened once in the deep past and is not really part of our evolutionary present, that most organisms live in intimate symbiosis with other organisms. So if you took your body and put a bag around it and then counted all the cells inside that bag, bacterial cells would outnumber your cells tenfold. So we ourselves are basically a committee. We live in very close association with bacterial symbionts. They help train our immune system. They ensure the proper development of our intestines. They help us to get maximum nutritional advantage from food. So the point I just wanted to make was that this isn't something just deep in the past that happened. It is all around us, and all organisms live in close association with others.
Thank you. If that makes feel you better, I always complain about the size of my ears, but I mean, sí.
Thank you, it doesn't, but thank you nonetheless.
Buenas noches, muchas gracias. Quisiera que nos analizaran, nos platicaran a manera comparativa un pronóstico de qué tan evolucionados son estos tres seres y qué éxito podrían tener a un futuro para resistir cambios. Un gusano, un ser humano y un virus. Gracias.
At first I thought he was going to say the three beings up on stage, but so I'm going to kick this one over to Andy to answer.
A worm, a human being, and a virus. Well, let me say something about viruses, because viruses are very interesting. As was pointed out earlier today, they can even be voted in or out of living beings depending on your definition of life. The important thing about viruses is that they are dependent on the genome or the genetic system of the cells they invade for their own reproduction. So in a sense, if I have a virus, or the humans have a virus that is very highly adapted for using humans as its basically engine of reproduction, as soon as humans disappear, that virus will disappear as well. We also know, in terms of making vaccines against viruses, that every year there are new forms or new variants of viruses of diseases that we know much about. So they are, I think in Bruce's terms, viruses would be extremely volatile, and at the same time they're extremely dependent on a host. So I'm not sure, I mean, viruses will always be with us, but specific viral types, I think, may have fairly short lifetimes. Worms in humans? Oh, that's a hard one. I would like to bet on humans just because I am one, but I think the difference between worms and humans is that worms don't have thermonuclear bombs, and so therefore, on a time scale of hundreds of years, you might want to bet on that worm. So.
Yeah, I would really concur with Andy on that. I mean, I definitely, on the whole, would rather be a human, though the worm day to day is not thinking about its mortality as much as, let's say, Woody Allen or I am. So that is a bit of a plus. Evolutionarily, I do think worm species survive longer than average. So it's at a species level that I think it's the benefit to be the worm. At the individual organism level, I'd certainly rather be a human. And even at the scale of lifespan, a human versus worm, a human is going to last longer. So I think your question brings up an important distinction between what is best at the individual organism level versus what is best at the species level. And we may recognize that many times what we do as individuals may or may not benefit our species. So I think that a variety of answers would be right, which is okay. But it's a good question.
Yo quisiera agregar que estaba pensando justamente en preguntar la opinión que mis dos colegas tienen sobre los virus, porque yo tengo la sensación de que los virus nunca se extinguen. Hay unos pocos grandes grupos de virus que podemos reconocer en función del tipo de material genético que tengan y de la manera en que se reproducen. Y si ustedes se ponen a ver, hemos sido capaces de extinguir el pájaro dodo Y si ustedes recorren los pasillos del Colegio Nacional, verán estas figuras espléndidas, esquemáticas que se hicieron de especies que hemos extinguido con una eficiencia extraordinaria. Pero los virus no se extinguen, solamente hay 2 tipos de virus que hemos logrado extinguir en términos concretos, que son el virus de la viruela, por un lado, gracias a las vacunas, y un virus Rimpest que afecta a unas vacas alemanas. Bueno, creo que afecta a vacas de cualquier lado, pero específicamente fueron ese virus el que se acabó. Hay virus que perdieron la independencia y que son los retrovirus endógenos que todos nosotros tenemos y heredamos verticalmente. Y esos retrovirus endógenos, que alguna vez tuvieron una estrategia replicativa como la del virus del SIDA, por ejemplo, o la de algunos virus involucrados en ciertos cánceres, son virus que entraron en la línea germinal de los humanos, de hecho de los primates, y sabemos que algunos genes que están involucrados en la formación de estas células que se fusionan durante la infección de un retrovirus son los mismos genes que están involucrados en la formación de la placenta, que es en realidad una célula grandotota. De manera que allí el virus perdió toda la independencia que puede tener un bacteriófago o un virus de la influenza, se convierten en parte del genoma de los primates y esto es totalmente equivalente a una idea de la evolución, por ejemplo, por simbiosis, en que las mitocondrias ya no pueden volver a ser independientes. Entonces hay analogías ahí que creo que es importante mencionar. Lo que también creo que es importante tener en cuenta es que en biología no pensamos en el árbol de la evolución como un ciprés que va hacia arriba, no pensamos en una visión teleológica de la evolución, sino que como el propio Darwin alguna vez lo dijo, probablemente el mejor modelo de la evolución sea un coral que se dispersa en todas direcciones o que avance en todas direcciones. Ciertamente hay restricciones anatómicas, funcionales, metabólicas, ya Bruce mencionó algunas de ellas, las discutió con bastante detalle, pero hay que recordar que en realidad la evolución va en todas direcciones y no sigue un camino preferencial. Esto es muy importante porque probablemente la parte más radical de Darwin, probablemente la parte que más aterró a sus críticos que se pusieron a leerlo con cuidado, es cuando dijo que la evolución natural no tiene ni fines ni objetivos, solo produce resultados. Y eso es una parte extraordinariamente radical.
Hola, perdón, buenas tardes. Mi pregunta es para los tres. A mí me gustaría, o bueno, me interesa mucho saber su opinión sobre, fuera de esta visión antropológica que tenemos, ¿no? Sobre salvar al oso panda, salvar a la vaquita marina y demás. Se supone que ahorita nosotros estamos atravesando, o se sospecha que estamos en la 6ª extinción masiva, ¿no? O bueno, es lo que he llegado a leer. Entonces, también he leído sobre ciertas opiniones, bueno, todas estas nos ponen a nosotros, a Homo sapiens sapiens, como el principal actor, ¿no? O agente de esta extinción. Pero también he leído que, bueno, nosotros podemos estar aquí, bueno, somos resultado de muchos años de evolución y que por lo tanto nosotros podríamos estar simplemente actuando como nos tocaría actuar. O sea, fuera de esta visión de hay que cuidar todo lo que tenemos, todas las especies, he leído esta opinión de, pues nosotros estamos acá como resultado de la evolución y por lo tanto estamos actuando como tal, como deberíamos actuar, como nuestra especie se supone que debe actuar. Entonces, hay algunos que llegarían a considerar esta extinción como algo natural, pues por nuestro comportamiento, ¿no? Es como mi pregunta sobre qué opinión tienen ustedes sobre este contexto, estas opiniones.
Okay, well, I think the first thing to say is that without question, as far as I'm concerned, we are a product of 4 billion years of evolution, but rather than think that gives us a free pass to treat the environment in any way we wish, I would interpret that to mean that we are the stewards of the environment, that we have inherited a world that has something on the order of 10 million species of eukaryotic organisms, probably at least an equivalent level of diversity in bacteria and archaea. And I think that in some ways it is almost our moral responsibility to try and preserve as much of that diversity as we can. And that, I think, leads to the important thing about humans. We are distinct from the successful competitors in the past in that we can actually think about what we do. And if we choose to do so, we can act in different ways. In terms of what may happen over the next 100 or 200 years, I think it's worthwhile thinking in terms of two different kinds of stresses that humans put on the environment. We all know that there have been a moderate number of extinctions of species over the last 100 years, and those were caused mainly by human changes in habitat, taking forests and turning them into agricultural lands, for example, overexploitation of species, hunting out top carnivores or fish species, and pollution. Now, notice what I didn't mention in that was global change. It's not clear that global change has played a very large role in extinctions over the last 100 years. The worry is that global change is now an accelerating reality, and that it is unlikely that all of the stresses that were working in the last 100 years are going to stop. So we now face the prospect of having continuing habitat change, overexploitation and pollution visited upon a world that itself is changing with unusual geological rapidity. So I think unless we choose to do something different, and unless we choose to have practices that will conserve diversity as best we can, I think it is possible that, within the lifetimes of, say, your great-grandchildren, we may be in a world that has extinction levels that would be geologically unusual. Maybe not a mass extinction on the level of the end of the Permian, but something that a geologist coming along 20 million years from now would notice. So again, I would just end by saying, yes, we do live in a time of an unusual environmental vulnerability for many of the species on this planet, and if there is any good news here, it's that we are a thoughtful, creative species that has, I think, the capacity to limit the extinctions if we choose to do so.
No. Yeah, I 100% concur with what Andy said, and I'd like to thank you for your question too. And in some respects, I think you're playing devil's advocate, and that's okay. I do think it's a moral imperative to preserve species, and I'm not somebody who's religious, but even for those people that for some reason might think, hey, why should we care about the panda bear? Why should we care about the sea cow? Just from selfish perspectives, I think we have to recognize that if we start removing too many species from our ecosystems, it will ultimately lead to our own collapse. Now, I'm not saying that's the only reason or the best reason not to do it, but for those that just want to think of it in a selfish sense, we know in the fossil record, once too many species go, it can lead to ecosystem collapse, and which ultimately would probably bring us down with the entire ship. One other thing I would say too is, just as by analogy, yes, we know we're all going to die, but if something's bothering us, we go to the doctor too, right? So I think we, in general, don't behave in the way, the alternative devil's advocate way that you said. We usually behave in a way that is prudent, that benefits ourselves and is the right thing to do. I mean, not everybody, of course, but on the whole, our species does behave in that way. So that's another add-on for why I'd advocate preserving biodiversity, really at any cost.
Bueno, yo nada más quisiera agregar que, por supuesto que coincido con lo que están diciendo tanto Bruce como Andy, pero sí quisiera agregar un punto, que efectivamente el destino de toda especie es eventualmente extinguirse, pero el problema es la tasa de extinciones que estamos introduciendo con unos modos de producción y de explotación de los sistemas que son absolutamente aterradores, por una parte. Y por otra parte, cuando uno habla de los riesgos de acabar con la biodiversidad, estamos hablando también de los riesgos en términos de identidad cultural, de tradiciones intelectuales. Piensen ustedes, por ejemplo, para poner un caso muy obvio, la gastronomía mexicana, que es un reflejo de la utilización muy adecuada, con raíces ancestrales, de una diversidad biológica absolutamente extraordinaria. Y eso, y viendo a la gastronomía como una demostración de la cultura de un país, de un pueblo, piensen también en otras posibilidades como la excelente pintura de Olga Costa, de la vendedora de frutas, que está en el Museo de Arte Moderno, que es una demostración de una continuidad de utilización de los recursos vegetales que tenemos desde las épocas previas a la conquista. O piensen en los poemas de Carlos Pellicer, que son un canto a la diversidad biológica de las selvas tropicales, que nos estamos acabando muy rápidamente, ¿no? Entonces yo sí creo que ahí tenemos un imperativo ético, diría yo, no moral, pero esa es una sutileza, y probablemente eso depende de tomar conciencia de que aunque el destino final de toda especie es la extinción, nosotros no tenemos por qué ser agentes catalíticos activos en ese sentido. Tenemos tiempo para una pregunta más, por favor.
Buenas tardes, gracias a los tres. Hace algunos 2, 3 años hubo un coloquio también aquí en el colegio sobre la medida. Entonces, en la ponencia de José Sarucán mencionó que en los últimos 10,000 millones de años, algo así, cuando fue la última era glacial, eso ha habido una estabilidad geológica y eso ha permitido que la humanidad se vaya civilizando. Aquí ya vienen muchas cuestiones, debemos que madurar, han pasado muchas culturas, han evolucionado y hemos aprendido de lo que nos aportaron. Eso nos va a llevar a un futuro, ¿no? A colonizar el día que se aloque el planeta, que ya hay inestabilidad, van a pasar millones de años, pero para eso está la educación y buscar otras alternativas, ya sea otros planetas más cercanos, otras alternativas de vida, con estos estudios que se van dando. Puede ayudar, y me voy a salir un poquito ya del tema. A Bruce, mencionó mucho la economía,
no
tiene un doctorado, bueno, ahorita ves el comentario, me llamó mucho la atención. En los años 30, con el crack económico que se vivió, tengo unos apuntes que conservo de 1992, donde habla sobre Alemania, devaluó su moneda para evitar fuga de capitales extranjeros, en este caso es el dólar. México experimentó algo así en los 90, a finales de los 90, no teníamos muchos recursos, muchas reservas internacionales, algo así como 12,000 millones de dólares. Si no se hubiera hecho esa devaluación, nos hubiésemos ido a la quiebra. Entonces, ahorita ya tenemos algo, fluctúa, ¿no?, entre los 200,000 millones de dólares, pero no se aportan recursos a los estados porque no tienen la capacidad para darle proyectos de infraestructura a largo plazo, se lo roban en muchos casos. O sea, no quiero abordar más al tema. Aquí hay un economista, Leopoldo Solís, me gustaría algún día conocerlo. Entonces, más o menos estos apuntes los relaciono con él. Estos comentarios, gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. El doctor Solís, como todos los miembros del Colegio Nacional, participa en una serie de actividades de difusión de la cultura y entonces es usted bienvenido a alguna actividad en la que él participe. Nada más déjenme decirles que esa idea de que si nos echamos la Tierra nos quedan otros planetas es más bien una divina ilusión. Yo tengo algunos candidatos que me gustaría efectivamente enviar a colonizar a otros cuerpos del sistema solar, pero creo que por el momento la mayor parte de nosotros tenemos que resignarnos a vivir en este cuerpo astronómico y cuidarlo lo más que se pueda. Bien, con eso yo quisiera darles las gracias a todos ustedes por su asistencia, quisiera darles las gracias al doctor Andy Knoll, a Bruce Lieberman, e invitarlos a que sigan participando en las actividades de estos eventos de Pensar la Muerte, que mañana van a incluir un concierto espléndido aquí en la Iglesia de la Enseñanza, cuyo nombre finalmente es parte de un elogio a la cultura y al conocimiento. Muchas gracias, buenas noches.
Thank you. It was fun.
El Colegio Nacional agradece su amable presencia y tenemos un aviso para usted. Tenemos un aviso importante que darle a usted. El día de mañana, sábado 22 de octubre, se repartirán los boletos para el concierto de las 19 horas. Esta repartición será justamente en el patio de este lado de Donceles, en el patio de las jardineras, en punto de las 18 horas. Recuerden que esto no tiene ningún costo para usted, solamente llegar un poco con anticipación. En punto de las 18 horas se hará la repartición de boletos para ingresar al templo donde se llevará a cabo el concierto de clausura de este importante encuentro Libertad por el Saber, Pensar la Muerte. Por su atención, gracias. Buenas noches.